Hi all, welcome back to my channel Learn with Girish. Today I will going to talk about a tool called AKS-Construction, which will help in creating a Kubernetes cluster, mainly the Azure Kubernetes cluster. I have used this tool a couple of times and found it useful, so I thought of sharing it with you. Before looking at more detail on the tool, let's look at why do we need such a tool. So if you have created a Kubernetes cluster, right, you might have to decide on a lot of things before creating a cluster, and it may not be that simple or easy to create a cluster. So let's discuss about some of those decision points you might have to consider. So you might have to think about the type of CNI you want to use, the kind of storage you want to have in your Kubernetes cluster. You might have to think about the monitoring part, whether you want to use a open source tool like Prometheus or Grafana, or you might want to use some managed component like Azure Monitor. You might think of creating your cluster as a private cluster which might be only accessible within the environment, or also look at how do you connect your cluster to your on-prem environment. So there might be many decisions like this you have to consider before creating a cluster. So this tool AKS-Construction will help in decide some of the feature which we want in our Kubernetes cluster. Based on the feature selection, it will provide us with the deployment scripts which we can use from a command line like a Cloud Shell, or also it provides scripts which we can use in the Terraform scripts, and also it provides snippets which we can use in our GitHub action as part of our CI/CD pipeline. This tool AKS Construction is an open source project and we can also do contribution to it. The way it works is it has a set of bicep templates, and you can think of these templates as the Terraform templates for Azure, and internally these bicep templates are compiled to something called as ARM templates, which is the native way of creating infrastructure in Azure. Let's take a look at the README file over here. So here it tells about how this tool accelerates the creation of cluster by providing the templates and deployment scripts as per some of the operational and security needs, which we'll take a look very shortly. And if you come down, here are some of the steps we need to follow. There are a total of 4. The first one being the link to the tool itself. The second one being where we select some of the principle which we want to have for that Kubernetes cluster, like the operational and the security principles. And then we would fine tune some of the cluster requirements, and then the tool itself would provide scripts which we would use to deploy either from the command line or from the GitHub actions or from the Terraform scripts. Let's take a look at the tool. So I have navigated to this link over here. So if you see here, you would have multiple options over here. Currently principle driven is selected. In this we have 2 principles, one being the operation, the other being the security. So if you want to create a bare bones cluster and decide on the things you want to install later, then you would choose this option. If you want to have open source projects like Prometheus and Grafana and plan to do the upgrades and scaling yourself, then you would choose this option. If you want to have a more managed environment where the scaling and upgrade is taken care, then you would go with this option. If you want to have a cluster wherein you don't have sensitive data, then you would choose this option. If you need minimum security controls wherein you specify the authorized IP ranges the cluster can access, then you would go with this option. And if you want have sensitive data and want to have a regulated environment, then you would go with this private cluster option, wherein you would have things like private link and also restrict egress with Azure firewall. Then you would go with this option. Note that this would be the very complex environment to operate on. Now let's see the Azure landing zone. So these are some of the best practices given by Microsoft. And if you want to have a dev test kind of cluster, then you would go for the sandbox scenario. If you want to have a cluster with on-premise connectivity, then you would go with this option. And if you want to have an application which is like internet facing, then you would go with this option. Note that in this option you would restrict egress with Azure firewall. Then comes the AKS secure baseline option. So in this you could choose standard if you want to have a secured standard cluster. And one good thing about this tool is if you are not aware of any of these options, you can click on this link and get more details on that. And if you want to have workloads hosted on the regulated environment, you could go with this option. Note that here again the private cluster would be enabled. And the final being the gaming option. Here if you want to have a small compute node with less than 5 players, you can go with this option with single node cluster. But if you want to have a large compute node with more than 5 players, then you could go with the dedicated system pool and user pool. So this was the step wherein we selected the features what we want in our cluster. So let's go to the third step over here, which is fine-tuning some of the parameters in the cluster. Here you can specify the name of the cluster, the resource group where the cluster need to be created, the version for the Kubernetes cluster, the location, and the IP address which would access the Kubernetes cluster. And here there are some of the default options which are already selected. If you go to cluster details, here you can select the type of cluster, whether it's a fleet cluster with 99.5% of SLO or a cluster with SLA of 99.9%. Then you can choose the system pool type, whether you want to have a standard one or the one which is cost optimized. Next you can select the user pool type, whether it's a Linux operating system or the Windows operating system. Likewise, you can specify the scale, the compute type, select whether you want to deploy it in a single zone or a multiple zone scenario. And then you can also choose the type of upgrade, whether you want to have a stable kind of upgrade or a rapid kind of upgrade. Then the authentication type and the cluster API security, whether you want to have no restriction or allow only certain IP ranges to be accessed, or whether you want to choose a private cluster. And also here you can specify whether you want to do etcd encryption or not. Coming to the add-ons, here you can select whether if you want to use the containers from Docker Hub, or whether you want to choose container from Azure Container Registry. In case you want to create private cluster, then you might have to go with the Azure Container Registry premium tier, which would support the private link. You would then select the type of ingress, whether you would use the Azure Application Gateway or any of the open source Nginx controller. You would also select here the monitoring requirements, whether you want to go for Azure Monitor or open source tool like Prometheus and Grafana. You can decide on the policy you want, whether you don't want no restriction or you want to audit on some of the non-compliancy or completely block the non-compliant workloads. Here you would choose the type of network policy you want to have. You can use Calico to implement the network policies. And then you would select the CSI secret, which would store the Kubernetes secrets in Azure Key Vault. And then you would decide on the file storage and the disk storage, which would be helpful whenever you are creating stateful sets. And then you would select some of the add-ons like KEDA Open Service Mesh and the new feature, which is the workload identity. And also you can also opt for the GitOps agent to be installed and few other things like this. And then you can go to networking details over here. Here you can decide on the type of CNI you want to have, whether you want to have dynamic IP allocations wherein the pod IP address comes from the VNet, or whether you want to have this overlay feature which would help in preserving the IPs, or you would go in with the Cilium, which is based on ePPF. Then you would select how do you implement AKS egress traffic, either using a load balancer or a managed gateway. And then you would decide on the Azure firewall for cluster egress, and then specify the CIDR range for your cluster. And then here, if you go to the last tab, the sample apps tab, here you can choose the type of app which you want to install on your cluster. So here you can select secure Java, and this application would require some of these add-ons which are automatically selected over here. And also it provides the script which you can use to install the application. And for .NET microservice and full stack TypeScript, I think the work is still in progress. So this was the third step. So we'll go to the final step. Here, once you fine tune the parameters, right? You can come here and get the appropriate commands to create the cluster. These are the commands which you can run in your command line. Likewise, the tool would also provide you the GitHub actions which you can include in your CI/CD pipeline, and also it will provide you with the Terraform scripts which you can use along with the Terraform parameter file. So I hope this was helpful. Let me know what do you think about this tool, and in case you are new to this channel, subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for more videos like this. Thank you.